Man tosses dog into the streets, then something unbelievable happens next. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The streets were eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm. Jake tugged the hood of his sweatshirt over his head, glancing down at the scruffy dog trotting faithfully beside him. Max's tail wagged hesitantly, his shaggy fur matted from days without a proper bath. He looked up at Jake with trusting, wide brown eyes, unaware of what was about to happen. Jake's jaw clenched as he stopped at the corner of a busy intersection. The sound of distant cars and the occasional honk echoed in the damp evening air. He looked down at Max, his heart heavy with a mixture of guilt and frustration. This wasn't how he had imagined things would turn out. 2 months ago, Jake had walked into the local animal shelter, determined to do something good for once. His life hadn't been going great, his recent breakup, mounting stress at work, and the suffocating loneliness of his small apartment had pushed him to the brink. The idea of adopting a dog had seemed like a simple solution to his problems. A companion, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Max had caught his eye immediately. The little terrier mix had been wagging his tail furiously, pressing his paws against the bars of his kennel and letting out an enthusiastic bark. The shelter worker had told Jake Max's story, a stray rescued from the streets, full of energy and a bit of a handful, but with a heart of gold. Jake had been sold, but reality hit hard. Max's boundless energy was more than Jake could handle. The dog chewed up his sneakers, barked at every passing car, and had an uncanny ability to escape the backyard despite Jake's best efforts to patch the fence. Every day felt like a battle, and Jake quickly grew resentful. "This isn't what I signed up for," Jake muttered under his breath as he reached down to unclip Max's leash. The dog looked up at him, his tail wagging uncertainly as if sensing the tension in Jake's voice. Jake's hand trembled. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice cracking. He looked away, unable to meet Max's gaze. "You'll be better off without me." He gave Max a gentle push toward the open sidewalk. The dog hesitated, his ears twitching, before taking a few cautious steps away. Jake turned on his heel and walked briskly in the opposite direction, his heart pounding in his chest. "Don't look back," he told himself, his fists clenched at his sides. "You're doing the right thing." But with every step, the weight of his decision grew heavier. He thought of Max's wagging tail when he came home, the way the dog would nuzzle his hand for attention, the unshakable loyalty in his eyes. Jake forced the memories away, quickening his pace. Behind him, Max stood frozen, his head tilted in confusion. The dog let out a soft whine, then a louder bark, his paws clicking against the pavement as he started to follow Jake. But the man didn't turn around. Rain began to fall, a light drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour. Max darted under an awning, his fur soaked and his tail tucked between his legs. He whimpered, looking out at the empty street as if hoping Jake would return. But Jake didn't. Hours passed, and the city's streets grew darker. Max ventured cautiously out from his shelter, sniffing the air and trotting down the wet pavement. He didn't understand why Jake had left him. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, had to find his way back to the person he trusted most in the world. The streets were unforgiving. Max darted between parked cars, avoiding the glare of headlights and the occasional shout for pedestrians. His stomach growled loudly, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since his last meal. He paused near a trash can, his nose twitching as he caught the faint scent of food. A half-eaten sandwich lay on the ground nearby, and Max hesitated only a moment before grabbing it and scarfing it down. His brief moment of relief was interrupted by a low growl. Max turned to see a larger dog, mangy, scarred, and mean-looking, stalking toward him. The stray bared its teeth, its eyes fixed on Max as it snarled a warning. Max backed away, his ears flat against his head. He wasn't a fighter. He had survived the streets once before by staying out of trouble, and he had no intention of challenging the bigger dog now. With a yelp, he turned and ran, his paws splashing through puddles as he fled down the street. He didn't stop until he was sure he was safe. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, Max found a quiet alleyway and curled up against the wall. His body trembled as he tried to sleep, but the cold and hunger made it impossible to rest. His thoughts drifted to Jake, the warm apartment, the sound of his voice, the way he'd scratched behind Max's ears just right. Despite everything, Max couldn't bring himself to be angry. All he wanted was to find his way back. Meanwhile, Jake sat in his darkened apartment, staring blankly at the television. The rain pounded against the windows, and the room was silent except for the occasional crackle of static from the TV. He hadn't bothered to turn on the lights or clean up the mess Max had left behind. The dogs chewed up toys and overturned food bowl sat untouched on the floor. Jake ran a hand through his hair, his chest tight with regret. "I did the right thing," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. "I wasn't good for him. He deserves better." But the image of Max's trusting eyes haunted him. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he'd walked away, the way Max had looked at him with confusion and hurt. Jake squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away, but they only grew louder. "Damn it," he said under his breath, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. The rain was still falling as he stepped outside, but he didn't care. He had to do something, anything, to quiet the gnawing guilt in his chest. Jake wandered the streets aimlessly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't know what he was looking for or where to start. The city felt impossibly big, and the chances of finding Max seemed slim. But he kept walking, his eyes scanning every alleyway and corner. By morning, Max had made his way to a busier part of the city. The streets were bustling with people heading to work, umbrellas bobbing in the crowd as the rain continued to drizzle. Max weaved through the sea of legs, his head low and his movements cautious. As he crossed a busy intersection, a sudden commotion caught his attention. A young boy, no older than 5, had broken free from his mother's grasp and darted into the street. The boy was chasing after a ball, oblivious to the oncoming traffic. Max froze, his instincts kicking in. Without hesitation, he bolted toward the boy, barking loudly to draw attention. The child turned just as a car screeched around a corner, its headlights glaring in the rain. With a burst of speed, Max reached the boy and pushed him back with his body, sending the child tumbling to the curb. The car slammed on its brakes, skidding to a stop just inches from Max. The dog stood in the middle of the street, panting heavily, as the boy's mother ran to her son, her face pale with fear. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling as she hugged the boy tightly. The child nodded, his wide eyes fixed on Max. "The dog saved me," he said softly. The mother turned to Max, her expression shifting from fear to gratitude. She crouched down, her hand outstretched. "Good boy," she said gently. "You're a hero." Max wagged his tail tentatively, his body still trembling from the ordeal. A small crowd had gathered, their murmurs filled with admiration for the scruffy dog who had risked his life to save a child. Someone pulled out their phone, snapping a photo of Max as he stood proudly in the rain. "What a brave dog," one person said. "Someone needs to take care of him." Unbeknownst to Max, the moment would soon make headlines. The scruffy, abandoned dog who saved a child's life was about to become a local hero. The photo of Max standing in the middle of the rain-slicked street, his fur drenched but his posture proud, spread like wildfire. By the next morning, news outlets were running the story under headlines like "Brave Stray Saves Boy from Oncoming Traffic" and "Hero Dog Steps in Where Humans Couldn't." Social media was abuzz with posts about the selfless dog, each one accompanied by the now-famous picture. People from all over the city wanted to know more about the scruffy hero. Max, meanwhile, had no idea of his newfound fame. After the boy's mother had ushered her son to safety, she tried to coax Max into following her home. But despite her kind words and the treats she offered, Max had bolted, his instincts pushing him to keep moving. He couldn't explain it, but something deep inside told him he still needed to find Jake. Back on the streets, Max was navigating the city with the same resilience he'd relied on before Jake had come into his life. But this time, something felt different. People were starting to recognize him. Strangers would pause, crouching down to call out to him with warm voices and open hands. Some offered him food, while others tried to take his picture. Max, wary but grateful, would accept scraps before darting away again, his sharp eyes scanning the streets for any sign of Jake. Across town, Jake sat slumped on his couch, his phone buzzing relentlessly on the coffee table. He hadn't gone to work that morning. He couldn't bring himself to face the world, not with the guilt that weighed so heavily on him. Instead, he stared blankly at the TV, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret and self-recrimination. A sudden knock at the door broke him out of his haze. Jake frowned, pushing himself up and crossing the small apartment to open it. His neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Carla, stood there, her phone clutched in her hand and an excited expression on her face. "Jake, you've got to see this," she said without waiting for an invitation, thrusting her phone toward him. Jake blinked, confused, as he took the phone. On the screen was a grainy photo of Max. The scruffy terrier stood in the rain, his ears perked and his tail slightly wagging. The headline beneath the image read, "Stray dog saves child in daring rescue." Jake's heart stopped. "Is that?" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Max, isn't it?" Carla said, her eyes wide. "The dog you adopted? Everyone's talking about him. He saved a kid from getting hit by a car. Can you believe that?" Jake stared at the image, a lump forming in his throat. Max looked so small, so vulnerable, yet there was a quiet strength in his stance that Jake couldn't ignore. The memories of that rainy night came flooding back, the moment he'd unclipped Max's leash, the way the dog had hesitated as if begging him to reconsider. "Where is he now?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. Carla shrugged. "No one seems to know. People have spotted him around the city, but he keeps running off. They're calling him a hero." Jake handed her phone back, his mind racing. He needed to find Max. He needed to make things right. For the next several days, Jake scoured the city. He checked shelters, combed through alleyways, and stopped strangers on the street to ask if they'd seen the scruffy dog from the news. Everywhere he went, he carried a bag of treats and Max's favorite squeaky toy, hoping the familiar scent might draw the dog to him. The city seemed impossibly large, and with each passing hour, Jake's hope began to waver. He replayed their last moments together in his mind, the way Max had looked at him with such unshakable trust. "I don't deserve him," Jake muttered under his breath as he wandered yet another block. "But I'll do whatever it takes to get him back." One afternoon, as Jake walked along the edge of a park, he heard a commotion up ahead. A small crowd had gathered near a playground, their voices animated as they pointed toward the trees. Jake quickened his pace, his heart pounding. Could it be Max? When he reached the edge of the group, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing a few feet away, was Max. The dog's fur was still scruffy, but his eyes were bright, and his tail wagged cautiously as he sniffed at a piece of bread a woman had tossed toward him. "Max," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. But Max's ears perked up at the sound. The dog turned, his eyes locking onto Jake's with an intensity that made the world around them fade away. Jake dropped to his knees, holding out his hands. "It's me, buddy," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry. I never should have left you." For a moment, Max didn't move. His eyes searched Jake's face, as if trying to decide whether to trust him again. The crowd watched in silence, the tension palpable. Then, slowly, Max took a step forward. And another. Before Jake could even process what was happening, Max was in his arms, his tail wagging furiously as he licked Jake's face. Jake laughed through his tears, holding the dog tightly. "You're a hero," Jake said, his voice trembling. "But you've always been my hero." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers and claps filling the air. Someone shouted, "That's the guy from the shelter. He's Max's owner." Jake looked up, his face flushed with emotion. "I let him down," he admitted, his voice breaking. "But I'll never let that happen again." The story of Max's reunion with Jake quickly made its way onto social media, and within hours, it was being shared across the city. People were touched by the tale of redemption and forgiveness, and many offered their support. Local businesses donated supplies for Max, from food to toys to a new bed, while a nearby trainer offered free obedience classes to help Jake and Max build a stronger bond. For Jake, the real reward was having Max back. The once distracted and frustrated man found a new sense of purpose in caring for the dog who had so selflessly risked his life. He spent hours each day walking Max through the park, playing fetch, and working on commands. The dog, in turn, seemed happier and more relaxed, his boundless energy channeled into their daily activities. One day, as they sat together on a bench overlooking the city, Jake reached down to scratch behind Max's ears. "You've changed my life, you know that," he said softly. "I thought I was rescuing you, but you're the one who saved me." Max tilted his head, letting out a soft bark as if in agreement. Jake smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he and Max were a team now, and nothing would ever come between them again. In the weeks that followed, Jake and Max settled into a new routine, one defined not by frustration or guilt, but by mutual trust and companionship. It was a transformation Jake hadn't expected but welcomed wholeheartedly. Every morning, Max would leap onto the bed, his tail wagging furiously, nudging Jake awake for their daily walk. For the first time in months, Jake felt like he had a purpose, a reason to greet each day with something other than dread. Their walks became an event of their own. People in the neighborhood began to recognize Max from the news, and strangers would stop to say hello, often offering treats or asking for a photo with the now famous hero dog. At first, Jake found the attention overwhelming, but he quickly realized how much it meant to people. Max wasn't just his dog anymore. He was a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and redemption. One sunny afternoon, Jake and Max were strolling through the park when a young boy ran up to them, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, look. It's Max," he shouted, pointing at the scruffy terrier. The boy's mother followed closely behind, a smile spreading across her face as she recognized the dog. Jake crouched down, giving Max a gentle pat. "Looks like you've got a fan, buddy," he said with a chuckle. The boy hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Can I pet him?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "Of course," Jake said, motioning for Max to sit. The dog obeyed, his tail wagging as the boy reached out to stroke his fur. Max let out a contented huff, leaning into the boy's hand. "Thank you for saving that other kid," the boy said earnestly, looking up at Jake. "Max is a real-life superhero." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he nodded. "Yeah, he is," he said softly. "He's the best dog I could ever ask for." The boy's mother smiled warmly. "It's amazing what he did, and it's wonderful to see how much he means to you." Jake smiled back, his hand resting on Max's head. "He's changed my life," he admitted. "More than I ever thought possible." Despite the newfound joy in their lives, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Max's story wasn't over. The attention from the media had quieted down, but there was still a buzz around the dog's heroic actions. Jake began to wonder if there was a way to channel Max's fame into something meaningful, something that could make a difference for other animals like him. One evening, as Max lay curled up on the couch beside him, Jake grabbed his laptop and began to type. The words came slowly at first, but soon they began to flow, each sentence fueled by a deep sense of purpose. He wrote about Max's journey, from his days as a stray to his time in the shelter, and finally to the night he saved a child's life. He wrote about the challenges they had faced together, the mistakes he had made, and the lessons he had learned. When he was finished, Jake sat back and read through the piece. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and he hoped it would inspire others to see the value in rescuing animals like Max. He submitted the story to a local newspaper, thinking little of it. But to his surprise, the piece was published within days, sparking a wave of interest from readers who were moved by Max's tale. Emails began to pour in from people who had been touched by the story. Some shared their own experiences with rescue animals, while others expressed a newfound desire to adopt from shelters. Jake was overwhelmed by the response, but it also filled him with a sense of responsibility. Max's story was making a difference, and he wanted to do more. Encouraged by the feedback, Jake reached out to the animal shelter where he had first met Max. He arranged a meeting with a director, a kind woman named Beth who had dedicated her life to rescuing and rehoming animals. "Max has become a bit of a local celebrity," Jake said with a grin as they sat down in Beth's office. Max lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws as he dozed contentedly. "I was thinking we could use his story to raise awareness for the shelter." Beth's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea," she said. "We're always looking for ways to reach more people and encourage adoptions. Max could be our ambassador." The two of them brainstormed ideas, eventually deciding on a community event at the shelter. They would host an open house where people could meet the animals, hear Max's story, and learn about the importance of adoption. Jake offered to speak at the event, sharing his journey with Max and the lessons he had learned. When the day of the event arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. Families wandered through the kennels, meeting dogs and cats in need of homes. Volunteers handed out brochures and answered questions, while children played with balloons and face-painted paw prints on their cheeks. Jake stood near the entrance, holding Max's leash as people approached to greet the famous dog. Max, ever the charmer, wagged his tail and licked every outstretched hand, his cheerful demeanor putting even the most hesitant visitors at ease. At the center of the shelter's courtyard, a small stage had been set up for Jake's speech. As the crowd gathered, Jake felt a surge of nerves, but one look at Max calmed him. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady despite the fluttering in his chest. "I want to share a story with you," a story about a dog who changed my life. He spoke about Max's journey, from his days as a stray to his adoption and eventual fame. He admitted his own mistakes, the night he had abandoned Max, and the guilt that had driven him to make things right. Max taught me something important, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. He taught me about forgiveness, resilience, and the power of second chances. He reminded me that even when we make mistakes, we can choose to do better. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. Jake glanced down at Max, who was sitting at his feet, his tail wagging softly. Max is a hero, Jake continued, but he's also a reminder that every animal deserves a chance. Every one of them has the potential to make a difference in someone's life, just like Max did for me. When he finished, the crowd erupted into applause. Jake stepped off the stage, his cheeks flushed. As people approached to thank him and ask questions about Max, Beth pulled him aside, her eyes shining with gratitude. "That was incredible," she said. "You've inspired so many people today." Jake smiled, his hand resting on Max's head. "Max deserves the credit," he said. "He's the real star." The event was a huge success, resulting in dozens of adoptions and a significant increase in donations for the shelter. Jake felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment, knowing that Max's story had made a tangible impact. In the weeks that followed, Jake continued to work with the shelter, volunteering his time and helping to organize more events. Max became a familiar face in the community, visiting schools and libraries to meet children and spread the message of compassion and adoption. Through it all, Jake and Max's bond grew stronger. They had become a team, united not just by their shared journey, but by a sense of purpose. Max had given Jake a second chance at life, and Jake was determined to do the same for others, both human and animal. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of Jake's apartment, watching the sun set over the city, Jake leaned down to scratch Max behind the ears. "You've done so much good," he said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Max looked up at him, his eyes filled with the unshakable trust that had always been there. He let out a soft bark, as if to say, "We did this together." And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Jake knew that their story was far from over. Together, they would continue to make a difference, one wag of the tail at a time. As the weeks turned into months, Max's story continued to ripple across the community. It wasn't just the locals who admired the scruffy terrier-turned-hero. The story began to attract attention from further afield. News outlets from neighboring towns and even national media began reaching out to Jake for interviews, wanting to feature Max's remarkable journey. Jake was initially hesitant. He didn't want to exploit Max's fame, but he realized that sharing their story could do even more good for the countless animals still waiting for homes. One afternoon, as Jake sat on the couch scratching Max's belly, his phone buzzed with an email notification. He glanced at the screen and froze. The subject line read, "Feature opportunity on National Morning Show." He opened the email, skimming the message. A producer from a popular daytime talk show wanted to feature Max and Jake on an upcoming episode about extraordinary animals. They were offering to fly them out to the studio and cover all expenses. Jake leaned back, processing the offer. "What do you think, Max?" he asked, holding his phone up as if the dog could read it. Max tilted his head, his tail thumping against the couch. Jake chuckled. "Yeah, I guess it couldn't hurt." 2 weeks later, Jake and Max found themselves on a plane for the first time. The airline staff had made special accommodations for Max, treating him like a VIP. As they landed and made their way to the studio, Jake couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and nerves. This was far beyond anything he'd ever imagined when he first walked into that shelter and saw Max's wagging tail. The studio was bustling with activity when they arrived. Producers and assistants rushed back and forth, setting up lights and cameras. Jake and Max were escorted to a green room, where they were greeted by the show's host, a charismatic woman named Lisa. "Jake, Max, it's such a pleasure to meet you both," Lisa said, crouching down to pet Max, who eagerly licked her hand. "He's even more adorable in person." Jake smiled, his nerves easing slightly. "Thank you for having us. This is all a bit surreal." Lisa laughed. "I can imagine. But your story is incredible, and I know our audience will love hearing it. Just relax and be yourselves." When it was time for their segment, Jake and Max walked onto the brightly lit stage to a round of applause. The audience awed as Max wagged his tail and looked around, his curiosity piqued by the cameras and lights. Jake took a seat on the couch, Max hopping up beside him. Lisa began the interview with a warm smile. "So, Jake, tell us about Max. How did you two meet?" Jake shared their story, from his initial decision to adopt Max to the challenges they faced and the mistakes he'd made. He spoke candidly about the night he'd abandoned Max and the overwhelming guilt that had driven him to make amends. "Max didn't just save that boy's life," Jake said, his voice steady but emotional. "He saved mine. He taught me about forgiveness and second chances, and he's given me a purpose I didn't know I needed." The audience applauded, some dabbing at their eyes. Lisa leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "It's clear that Max has had an incredible impact on your life, and now he's helping inspire others to adopt and care for animals in need. What's next for you two?" Jake hesitated, glancing down at Max, who was happily wagging his tail. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but I want to keep sharing Max's story and helping other animals find the love and care they deserve. If we can make even a small difference, it'll be worth it." Lisa smiled. "Well, I think you're already making a big difference. And we actually have a surprise for you." Jake blinked, surprised. "A surprise?" Lisa gestured toward the screen behind them, which lit up with a video montage of photos and clips of Max, from his early days in the shelter to his heroic rescue and the community events he'd attended. The video ended with a message: "Max's legacy, a fund for rescue animals." Jake's jaw dropped as Lisa explained. "With the help of some amazing donors, we've established a fund in Max's name to support local shelters and rescue organizations. The fund will provide resources for medical care, food, and adoption programs to help animals in need." The audience erupted into applause as Jake struggled to find the words. He looked down at Max, who was now sitting upright, seemingly basking in the attention. "Thank you," Jake said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "This means so much. Max has already given me so much, and now he's giving back to others. It's incredible." The segment ended with Jake and Max receiving a standing ovation. As they left the stage, Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the fun, but for the opportunity to share Max's story with so many people. Back home, life settled into a new rhythm. The fund in Max's name became a powerful force for good, raising awareness and support for rescue animals across the region. Jake continued to work closely with the shelter, organizing events and visiting schools to educate kids about the importance of compassion and responsibility when it came to animals. Max, for his part, seemed to thrive in his new role as a community ambassador. He loved meeting new people, especially kids, and his playful, friendly nature made him an instant favorite wherever he went. But despite his growing fame, Max remained the same scruffy, lovable dog Jake had fallen for in the shelter. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Jake reflected on how much had changed since that rainy night on the streets. "You know, Max," he said, scratching the dog behind the ears, "I used to think I was rescuing you. But now I know you were rescuing me." Max let out a soft bark, his tail wagging as he leaned into Jake's hand. Jake smiled, his heart full. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: as long as he had Max by his side, he could face anything. Months passed, and the Johnson family, Jake and Max, found themselves busier than ever. The Max's Legacy Fund had grown beyond anything Jake could have anticipated. Donations poured in not just from locals but from across the country. Rescue shelters that had been struggling to make ends meet now had the resources to care for more animals, provide necessary medical treatments, and improve adoption rates. Jake had turned into something of a public figure, but he remained humble, always redirecting the spotlight back to Max and the animals they were helping. Despite the attention, Jake stayed grounded, keeping his daily routine with Max intact. They still started each morning with a walk through the park, where Max would chase squirrels and greet every passerby with a wagging tail. One crisp autumn morning, as they strolled along their usual path, Jake noticed a small group of people gathered near the park's community bulletin board. Curious, he approached with Max trotting beside him. A flyer pinned to the board immediately caught his attention. It read, "Hero Dog Recognition Day, honoring the animals who inspire us." Jake read the details. The event was scheduled for the following weekend at the city's main square, and Max was listed as one of the honorees. Jake felt a swell of pride. He scratched Max behind the ears. "Looks like you're getting another award, buddy." Max responded with a happy bark, his tail wagging enthusiastically. The following week flew by in a flurry of preparations. Jake worked with the event organizers to ensure the focus remained on the animals, and the shelters that had benefited from Max's story. He even arranged for a group of adoptable dogs from the local shelter to be at the event, hoping the exposure would help them find loving homes. When the day of the event arrived, the city square was alive with energy. Booths lined the sidewalks, offering everything from dog treats to free veterinary consultations. Families strolled through the square with their pets, many of them stopping to take pictures with Max, who was undeniably the star of the day. Jake stood near the main stage, watching as the crowd grew. He spotted Beth, the shelter director, waving to him from one of the booths. She was surrounded by a group of wagging tails and excited children. Jake waved back, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the community that had come together to celebrate Max and the cause they had built. When it was time for the award ceremony, Jake and Max were called to the stage. The applause was deafening as they walked up the steps, Max's tail wagging so hard it was practically a blur. Jake took the microphone, smiling down at his scruffy companion. "Thank you all for being here today," Jake began, his voice steady but emotional. "This event isn't just about Max. It's about every animal out there waiting for a chance, waiting for someone to see their worth." He glanced at Max, who was now sitting obediently at his feet, his bright eyes scanning the crowd. "Max taught me that every life has value, no matter how small or scruffy or seemingly unimportant. He's shown me what loyalty, forgiveness, and unconditional love really mean. And I'm so grateful to be able to share his story with all of you." The crowd erupted into cheers as Jake finished his speech. A representative from the city stepped forward, holding a large plaque that read, "In honor of Max, a symbol of loyalty, courage, and hope." Jake accepted the plaque with a smile, kneeling down to hold it beside Max for the photographers. The dog barked happily, as if he understood the significance of the moment. After the ceremony, Jake and Max spent the afternoon mingling with the crowd. Families with young children approached, eager to pet Max and take photos. Some shared stories of their own rescue animals, while others thanked Jake for inspiring them to adopt. One young girl, no older than 6, approached shyly, clutching a small notebook. "Mr. Jake," she said softly, her wide eyes darting between him and Max. Jake knelt down to her level, smiling warmly. "Hi there. What's your name?" "Emily," she replied, holding out the notebook. "I drew a picture of Max. I hope you like it." Jake opened the notebook to reveal a colorful crayon drawing of Max standing proudly with a big, goofy grin. The words, "Max the Hero," were scrawled across the top in bold letters. Jake felt his heart swell as he looked at the drawing. "This is amazing, Emily," he said sincerely. "Max is going to love it." Emily beamed, her shyness melting away. She reached out to pet Max, who responded by licking her hand and wagging his tail. "I want to help animals like Max someday," she said. "Maybe I can work at a shelter when I grow up." Jake smiled, his chest tight with emotion. "That's a wonderful goal, Emily. The animals will be lucky to have someone like you." As the day wound down, Jake found a quiet moment to sit on a bench with Max. The dog was clearly tired but happy, his head resting on Jake's lap as he watched the last few families wander through the square. "You did good today, buddy," Jake said, stroking Max's fur. "You always do." Max let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping softly against the bench. Jake leaned back, gazing up at the sky as the first stars began to appear. He thought about how far they had come since that rainy night when he had walked away from Max, believing he wasn't capable of being what the dog needed. But Max had never given up on him. Even when Jake had made mistakes, Max had shown him the kind of loyalty and love that could change a person's life. And in return, Jake had found a purpose he never knew he needed. Over the next several months, Jake and Max continued their work with the shelter and the Max's Legacy Fund. They organized more events, visited schools, and even started a social media page to share updates about Max and the animals they were helping. The page quickly gained a following, with thousands of people tuning in to see Max's adventures. Jake shared everything from silly videos of Max chasing his tail to heartwarming stories of successful adoptions. Each post ended with a message encouraging people to support their local shelters and consider adopting a rescue animal. One day, as Jake was scrolling through the page's messages, he came across a note from a woman named Sarah. She wrote about how she had been struggling with loneliness and depression, but had found comfort in following Max's story. Inspired by his journey, she had visited her local shelter and adopted a senior dog named Rosie. "Thank you for sharing Max with the world," Sarah wrote. "He gave me the courage to open my heart again, and now Rosie and I are both happier than ever." Jake read the message aloud to Max, his voice thick with emotion. "You're changing lives, buddy," he said, scratching the dog behind the ears. "And not just mine." Max let out a soft bark, as if to say, "I'm just getting started." As the years went by, Jake and Max's bond only deepened. Max grew a little grayer around a muzzle, but his spirit remained as lively as ever. Together, they continued to inspire others, proving that even the smallest acts of kindness could have a ripple effect far beyond what anyone imagined. And though Max never sought recognition or fame, he became a symbol of hope for people and animals alike, a reminder that love, loyalty, and second chances could change the world. The years brought new adventures for Jake and Max, and with each one, their bond only grew stronger. Max's age began to show in small ways. His once boundless energy now gave way to more relaxed strolls through the park, and the scruffy terrier took longer naps in the afternoons. But his spirit, the spark of loyalty and determination that had defined him since that rainy night, remained as bright as ever. Jake, too, had changed. He had grown into someone he barely recognized from his former self, more patient, more empathetic, and deeply fulfilled by the life he had built with Max. The man who had once walked away from his dog was now someone who couldn't imagine a single day without him. One quiet morning, Jake sat on a porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand as Max lay at his feet. The early sunlight bathed the neighborhood in a golden glow, and the air was filled with the gentle chirping of birds. It was a peaceful moment, the kind that Jake had come to cherish. "You know, Max," Jake said, breaking the silence, "we've done a lot together, haven't we?" Max looked up at him, his ears twitching as if to say, "I know." Jake chuckled, reaching down to scratch the dog's head. "I don't know where I'd be without you." As if on cue, Jake's phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen and saw an email from the shelter. It was a thank you note filled with updates about the latest animals they'd helped through the Max's Legacy Fund. Several photos were attached, dogs and cats, once abandoned and scared, now thriving in their forever homes. Jake scrolled through the pictures, his chest swelling with pride. Each one was a testament to the ripple effect that Max's story had created. Families beamed with joy as they posed with their new pets, their lives forever changed by the simple act of opening their hearts. Max let out a soft bark, pulling Jake's attention back to him. "You did all this," Jake said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "You're more than a hero, you're a miracle." Later that day, Jake and Max headed to the park for one of their daily walks. The familiar path was dotted with memories, spots where Max had once chased squirrels, patches of grass where they'd rested in the shade. As they walked, people stopped to greet them, as they always did. Max, ever the charmer, wagged his tail and accepted pats and treats with his usual enthusiasm. At one point, a man approached, a leash in hand. At the other end of the leash was a young golden retriever, its tail wagging furiously as it tried to approach Max. "Is this the famous Max?" the man asked, his voice tinged with awe. Jake smiled. "That's him. He's not as spry as he used to be, but he's still Mac." The man crouched down, letting his retriever sniff at Max. "I just wanted to say thank you. My family adopted this guy because of Max's story. We'd never even considered getting a rescue before, but now I can't imagine life without him." Jake felt a lump in his throat as he nodded. "That means a lot," he said. "Max has a way of changing lives." The man stood, giving Jake a firm handshake before continuing on his way. As Jake watched him go, he felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Max's impact had extended far beyond what Jake had ever imagined. His story had inspired countless others to choose compassion, to believe in the power of second chances. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake sat on the couch with Max curled up beside him. He flipped through a scrapbook he had started years ago, filled with photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes from people who had been touched by Max's journey. Each page told a story. A child who had overcome their fear of dogs, a family who had found joy in adopting a rescue, a shelter that had saved more animals thanks to the fund. Jake paused on a photo of Max as a puppy, taken the day he had adopted him from the shelter. Max's fur had been scruffier, his eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Jake smiled, remembering how small and full of energy Max had been back then. "You've come a long way, buddy," he said, glancing down at Max. The dog let out a contented sigh, his head resting on Jake's lap. As the room grew darker, Jake felt a deep sense of peace. His life had been irrevocably changed by the scruffy terrier who had once been a stray. Max had taught him the true meaning of love, loyalty, and redemption. Together, they had built a legacy that would continue to inspire others long after their journey together had ended. The following spring, the city announced plans to create a new dog park, and they invited Jake and Max to the groundbreaking ceremony. The park would be named in Max's honor, a tribute to the dog who had brought so much joy and hope to the community. Jake was deeply moved by the gesture, knowing how much it would mean to Max. The day of the ceremony was bright and sunny, the perfect backdrop for the celebration. Families and their dogs gathered in the open field where the park would be built, eager to be part of the special occasion. Jake stood on the small stage, holding Max's leash as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," Jake began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This park is more than just a place for our dogs to play. It's a reminder of what can happen when we choose kindness, when we give second chances." He looked down at Max, who was sitting calmly at his feet, his tail wagging softly. "Max taught me that every life has value. He showed me that even when we make mistakes, it's never too late to make things right. And now his legacy will live on in this park, where dogs and their families can create their own stories." The crowd erupted into applause, and Jake knelt down to hug Max. The dog licked his face, his eyes shining with the same unshakable loyalty that had defined their bond from the start. As the park took shape over the next few months, Jake and Max visited frequently, watching as the space transformed into a haven for dogs and their owners. By the time the park officially opened, it was a beautiful expanse of green grass, shaded trails, and agility courses. A bronze plaque near the entrance read, "Max's Park, a place for second chances." Jake and Max were among the first to step through the gates on opening day. Max, despite his graying muzzle and slower pace, explored the park with the same curiosity and enthusiasm he had always shown. Jake watched with a smile, his heart full as he saw families and their dogs enjoying the space. As they sat together on a bench near the park's edge, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From that rainy night on the streets to the day Max had saved a child's life, every moment had been a stepping stone to something greater. "You've left your mark, Max," Jake said softly, stroking the dog's fur. "And I'm so proud to be part of your story." Max let out a soft bark, leaning into Jake's touch. Together, they watched the park come to life, their bond stronger than ever. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting the park in a warm golden glow, Jake knew that their story, one of redemption, love, and second chances, would live on in the hearts of everyone who stepped through those gates.